Hello and welcome to Newsbreak Chats. I'm Chai Hofilenia. Newsbreak is the investigative and in-depth section of Rappler. It's also your go-to place for unique stories, analysis, and explainers. This is our 10th episode under quarantine, and it's also our last for this year, 2020. By next week, it will be Christmas. So I'd like to greet everyone a very, very Merry Christmas despite these difficult circumstances. Today, we'll be chatting with three of our Rappler reporters and one new editor. Please welcome Paterno Esmaquel. He is our brand new news editor. Pia Ranada. Hi, Paterno. Brand new. Hi, Pia. Pia Ranada has been covering Malacanang. I'd also like to welcome Sofia Tomacruz, who covers foreign affairs, and she also has been writing about the pandemic. And lastly, Camille Elemia, who writes on the media and disinformation. And by the way, I'd like you to know that as part of changes for 2021, Camille Elemia will also be taking over as host of Newsbreak Chats. So the young ones are finally taking over. So welcome Camille, ikaw na bahala next year. So I'd like to begin our discussion by maybe asking the four of you, bahala na kayo, who wants to start. People always say that 2020 is such a horrible year and it's not yet over, but hopefully in a few days it will be over. But in one word, how would you describe it and why? Who wants to start? Pia, maybe?
Sige. Ako, looking at it through the lens of my beat, which is the Malacanang beat covering the Philippine president, I would describe 2020 as a very revealing year because I think that if in the past years, the crisis that hit the government, like many controversies that hit the Duterte admin, he's managed to get away with it in a way. And kumbaga, he's been able to use a lot of his alter egos to kind of mask whatever gaps there were. But a crisis like the pandemic revealed a lot about Duterte's leadership, and it exposed a lot of gaps and a lot of shortcomings on the part of the president. And even if he did get through it with still high approval ratings, I think more and more people started to see where his brand of leadership where it can fail and where it can show weaknesses, especially when it comes to a crisis like the pandemic.
Unmasking of Duterte.
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
I think for me, I describe it as disruptive in that it has forced everyone to change so many fundamentals in living, like in business, in attitudes, in cultures, and even in education. Actually, even in relationships now, like we're all virtual. And at the same time, it has also, I don't know, it has, since I mentioned the word disruptive and it's usually linked to technology, diba? Pero I think it has also to use Pia's word naman, unmasked the weaknesses of technology because now it's also the year that the world is realizing they have to take action. I mean, we need these things during the pandemic, but what's at stake? Alam mo yun, mas malalim pa dun. So now we're seeing not just Europe, but even the US and even other North American countries trying to run after these social platforms. All these things were highlighted during this year.
Interesting. Disruptive. So far we have revealing and disruptive.
For me, I would say that, yeah, taking off also from what Camille and Pia said, I think it's also related to what they said. But for me, my word would be painful. I think a lot of the disruption and the unmasking of, how President Duterte acted or failed to act brought a lot of pain across basically the entire so many different sectors and so many different industries. And painful also because it was a year of a lot of loss in terms of the pandemic happening and a lot of people getting sick and a lot of people dying as well. But um, a lot of pain as well because of the lack of decision making, quick and decisive action, and at the same time we all these decisions exacerbated already the weaknesses of our different government agencies, let's say, and that brought a lot of pain for people who had to who were at the receiving end of all those decisions.
And you sort of wonder, no, whether the pain that this year brought or will continue to bring until it ends is something that could have been prevented
Right.
or mitigated even, no? Paterno, what's your take?
Para sa akin, unimaginable. Tandang-tanda ko talaga nung December, nasa Singapore ako nag-aaral at nasa isang museum ako, pinapakita doon yung mga pinagdaanang hirap ng Singapore. In the last 40, 50 years, basta pagkatapos ng World War II, ang nakita ko doon, ang pinakamalaking problema na dinanas ng Singapore, SARS, yung Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome noong early 2000s. At sabi ko, buti na lang hindi ako nag-aaral dito nung panahon ng SARS, naka-face mask sila. Tapos, canceled siguro yung mga klase. Hindi ko alam yung gagawin ko. December yan. Pagdating ng January, February, aba, hindi lang parang SARS, pandemic pa. So, tingin ko, lahat ng mga sinabi kanina na description, masasaklaw niyan yung unimaginable. Hindi natin talaga inakala na mapupunta tayo sa ganitong sitwasyon ngayon. At para tayong in limbo, para tayong ganito ba yung dinanas ng mga lolo at lola natin nung panahon ng giyera na naghihintay matapos yung gulo, magkaroon ng resolution. At yung gulo na ito, hindi lang ito maayos on a personal level. Talagang mga bansa, kailangan magtulong-tulungan. Nakikita natin yan. Nung pagkatapos ng giyera, ng World War II, binuo yung United Nations, nagkaroon ng challenge na magtulong-tulungan yung iba-ibang bansa. Ngayon naman, may bago na namang challenge para sa mga bansa na sana magawa nila ng tama. Katulad ng dun sa mga vaccines, yung mga mahihirap na bansa na pagkakaila ng bakuna, sana magawa ng tama dahil talagang naapektuhan yung mga taong katulad natin. Yung mga tao na katulad ko noon na estudyante na nag-aaral, ito ay mahalaga na matutukan ng iba-ibang bansa. So yun, unimaginable. Hindi natin inakala na mapupunta tayo sa ganito.
Totoo yan. Akala natin nung January, di ba, merong taal, merong explosion. Akala natin that would be the worst. We never really thought that meron pang mas lalala pa doon. But sana, di ba, ito na yun. Hopefully next year wouldn't be any worse than what we've been through. Pero for me, no, this year, 2020, ironically, we call it 2020, sana perfect vision. I would associate the following words or phrases. So, nabanggit nyo na nga, one is pandemic, and then yung erosion of democracy, indicative yan not only in the Philippines, but even in neighboring countries. Pagkatapos, kaakibat niyan yung rise of authoritarianism. Pero siguro the positive thing then related to what you mentioned a while ago about action is yung activism. So those are the three things that I would associate with 2020. Meron ba kayong idadagdag doon sa tatlo?
I think for me it's connected to what you mentioned, since you mentioned the erosion of democracy, and we've been seeing all around the world the rise of disinformation. We've been hearing about this for years. Like in the Philippines, Rappler keeps on repeating what Facebook has been doing to us and to our company even. But now we're seeing na there's a parang medyo too late, pero it's better late than never na nagka-wake up call for them, especially with what happened since I was in the US. I noticed that people were more aware of the issues of misinformation, disinformation, especially the year before their election. Noong 2016, 2017, we really didn't feel it, but then napansin natin nung nandun tayo na mas nagiging OA sila doon. And when I came back here and started digging into these issues, I think I remember talking to Pia about this na we have to, it's getting to be like a more serious issue here because of the coming election year, and we have to prepare like on how to cover these issues because etong nangyayari sa 2020, it's a symptom of what's gonna happen next year for us. So I think it's also a warning.
Pia, you want to jump in there?
I think that, Miss Chai, the topics you mentioned, it already encapsulates things that I've seen in my beat, like yung anti-terrorism
Yeah.
law, yung shutdown of ABS-CBN. Parang those were the things that really shocked us this year aside from the pandemic. And the fact na sumabay pa yung mga ganitong pangyayari with the pandemic, I think it even heightened more the anxiety that people were feeling, at least especially here in the Philippines.
Ms. Shai, if I can add, I think one thing also, you encapsulated it in everything you mentioned, but then I think one thing that also captures the year is just this increased awareness and like hyper connectivity, where whether it be like the erosion of democracy or renewed activism, I think that a lot of people, because we were on lockdown, so many countries were on quarantine restrictions, and a lot of people saw similar things happening all over the world that were happening in their country, and it was a good thing because it helped to expose, or it helped to frame the way people viewed the what was happening currently around them. And I think one example of that, for example, would be like the series of protests that we saw all over the world, whether it be Europe, the US, and also here in Asia among our neighbors. And of course, similar things that are happening, let's say with the anti-terror law here, and also the security law in Hong Kong, and hyper connectivity and interconnectedness, of course, because of the pandemic and how that started that was first found in Wuhan in China, and of course the whole world now is affected by it.
Sa akin
Paterno.
yung things that define the year, parang masyado na nga marami itong binanggit nyo pandemic, authoritarianism, renewed activism, sobrang dami niyan. Palagay ko yung makakasaklaw nga talaga niyan, yung isang word na sinabi ni Camille kanina, wake up call. Palagay ko, ngayong patapos na yung 2020 at papasok tayo sa 2021, maganda dun tayo mag-focus Yung this is a wake up call for all of us, because we're now realizing yung mga sinabi nga ni Camille kanina. So mahalaga na tignan natin yung flip side kasi pag masyado tayong na-focus dun sa mga problema, mahalaga mag-focus sa mga problema, pero mahalaga din pag-usapan natin paano masosolusyonan yan. Dahil itong pandemic, bukod sa sinabi ko kanina na unimaginable, shocking, and it jolts us. It reminds us of the basics. And in international relations, one of these basics is what Sophia mentioned a while ago, interconnectedness, that countries are connected to each other, that what China does, for example, China hid COVID-19 from the rest of the world at first. It affected the whole world. So the authoritarianism of Xi Jinping affected people like me, people like us in the Philippines, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in America, in Europe. So that world interconnectedness, that the decisions of one dictator in one country can affect everyone in the world and cause a pandemic that would change our lives forever.
I like what you said about yung going back to basics, no? Kasi parang what we've been through, and I think I would add one word there, chaos. Parang 2020 is really a year of chaos. And you sort of just hope that out of the chaos, order will eventually emerge. Siguro, yun na nga, how will order emerge? Yun, magtulong-tulungan and people sort things out. So maybe 2021 will be a little bit better. But I'm curious though, because as journalists, we're all storytellers. And what was siguro for you the most important story that you think you've contributed, no? And this is the fun part about journalism. Parang we always say na you're at the front seat of history, and you're recording things as they happen. So kayo, when you were writing your actual reports, ano yung pinaka compelling siguro for you? Pia?
For me, it was really two stories. One was my in-depth on Duterte's crisis messaging, yung 56,000 words, parang Duterte crisis messaging, all bluster, little science. So yun yung first story ko that I really felt compelled to do. And then the second was my podcast, Seat of Power podcast episode, where I talked about medical populism and how Duterte exhibits medical populism along with si Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro. So the reason why ito yung two stories that I felt were important this year was because in my beat, like covering leadership, top leadership, the way that the pandemic tested Duterte, it was really like an unraveling on his part na parang if before nagfa-fly yung kanyang off-the-cuff banter, yung kanyang jokes, parang people were even amused by it, it was funny. With the pandemic, if you combine Duterte's messaging with a crisis like the pandemic, it was no longer funny. And I think more and more people began to realize that we get what we deserve. We get a leader, we voted him in, and we thought he was funny at first, we thought refreshing yung kanyang banter, yung kanyang way of messaging, but when you have a crisis like this, it's a very limited kind of leadership. And I think that the messaging and comparing Duterte's messaging with that of other leaders really showed, diba, where we stood in terms of our government and how it's faring in a crisis that is testing not just the Philippines but every country in the world and every leader in the world. And the Medical Populist podcast, it really showed, diba, na kasi I wrote that medyo a bit later na into the pandemic compared to the 50 the in-depth about crisis messaging, and doon na talaga nakita mo yung similarities between Duterte's messaging and that of other leaders. So it felt for me like a progression na parang at first it was just Duterte parang sounding parang like a broken record amidst all the other leaders who sounded at least that they had a handle on things, but eventually we saw that in fact Duterte was following a script that other leaders similar to him were also following. And funnily enough, these countries, the US and Brazil, also had out of control pandemics at the time. So it's also similar to the Philippines, where at the time we had the highest number of COVID-19 cases in Southeast Asia. So parang nakita mo na parang what's happening in the Philippines is mirrored elsewhere, and this crisis is testing leadership all over the world. And you can really see, diba, how the Philippines and our choice of leaders is measuring up.
But what's mysterious for me is that yes, there was parang na-expose yung vulnerabilities of Duterte, and yet he remains popular. In the case of the US naman, Trump's vulnerabilities were also exposed, but we saw that reflected in the victory of Biden. So in this case, parang we see parallelisms between the US and the Philippines in terms of competence in leadership, pero iba yung reception ng population, the mass audience. So that's wala lang, that's just one mystery for me insofar as Duterte is concerned. Anyone
I
else?
actually, in relation to what you said lang, like for a year, I kept on wondering, bakit, like we have similar kinds of president, diba, US and the Philippines, pero whenever I meet Americans, I feel like they know, not everyone, but like even in, I stayed in Arizona, it's a Republican country, and even if it's like a Republican country, you can feel that they are more like the voters are more aware of what's really happening. I think that's really one of the main differences, yung voter education and yung awareness ng voters, because I think it starts with their education system, kasi like strong yung civics nila, they really have a subject as early as as in serious sila sa civic subject nila. And I feel like maybe it could be that. Kasi iniisip ko talaga while I was there, bakit ganun? Bakit parang they care more about their country or their politics than yung mga voters dito sa atin? So I guess, I don't know if it's an effect of dumbing down the Filipino voters na hanggang ngayon ganun yung effect.
And let's not forget that even if Bolsonaro and Trump, even if Trump lost the elections, he still made a unexpected performance. And see, Bolsonaro actually, I read recently that despite his many failings in the pandemic, he still managed to retain his 37% popularity rating, which even if it sounds low for us, is actually his best. So he didn't get the parang he didn't attain a lower approval rating than before. So it's still similar to Duterte in a way that he was able to retain his popularity.
Paterno or Sophia, your
Yung
story.
sa akin, yung dun sa Singapore, gumawa ako ng story tungkol dun sa response ng Singapore sa COVID-19. Comparing that with the response of the Philippines. Nung nandun kasi ako, naranasan ko kung gaano kaiba yung atake nila sa COVID-19 at magandang maikumpara yun dun sa nangyayari dito sa Pilipinas. Sa pag-usapan natin yung mga world leaders, si Lee Hsien Loong ng Singapore, kahit may malaki silang pagkakamali, yung mga dormitory workers na nagkaroon ng explosion sa mga workers' dormitories dahil hindi nila inalagaan ng gusto. Pero simula pa lang ng pandemic, handa na lahat ng mga plano nila. Parang pipindutin na lang, i-activate na lang at yun, meron ng mga protocol, yung mga workplaces, yung gobyerno, may automatic na system na ng pagpapamigay ng mga mask. In fact, nagkaroon nga ako ng ilang bang free mask ang nakuha ko doon. Simula pa lang, free testing. Siyempre, mas mayaman sila na bansa. Granted yun. Pero yung makukumpara natin yung paghahanda eh. Kasi ang Pilipinas, kahit hindi naman ganun kayaman na bansa, kailangan man lang may makita kang kaunting paghahandaan, di ba? Kahit naman hindi ka ganun kayaman, makita naman may effort ka. Hindi yung nagtatago ka sa Davao, hindi yung magsasalita ka lang tungkol sa pandemic. Nakailang linggo na, nakailang kaso na sa Pilipinas, hindi ka pa nariringgan ng taong bayan. Yung mga ganyan, hindi mo kailangan ng pera eh. Para sabihin sa mga tao na relax lang kayo, nandito kami. Magpapakita ka lang sa TV eh. Bakit wala pa yung mga, biglang nawala yung mga live? Ngayon pang merong pandemic. Yung mga ganyang bagay, hindi natin po pwedeng masabi na hindi naman tayo kasing yaman ng Singapore, hindi tayo kasing yaman ng ibang bansa. May mga bagay na hindi nakukuha sa yaman pero hindi pa rin natin nakikita dito sa Pilipinas.
And yet, kung tutuusin, di ba, yung nakakagulat lang, sanay na sanay ang Pilipinas sa disaster. Parang every year, napaka-predictable niyan. Laging merong bagyo, laging, may volcanic eruption, may earthquake. So dapat meron na talagang protocol in place, di ba? Pero dito sa pandemyang ito, parang caught flat-footed na naman yung leaders natin. Anyway, sige. I was wondering also, Sophia, go.
Yeah, if I can add lang on Chai, I mean, Tyson also with what Tyson I see with what Paterno said. The two stories that came to mind for me were one on Filipino nurses overseas who are also serving as frontliners in so many different health systems abroad, and the second one being the story I did on the call of the doctors sometime in July, August, where they really sounded the alarm on the handling of the government and its response to the pandemic. I cite those two stories because, well, with regarding the latter, the call of health workers themselves, I remember this quote is still like something that I remember until today. Um, where Dr. Antonio Dans, who's also mind behind the universal healthcare law, he was saying that, um, the health system is the first to feel the effects, not word for word, but the health system is the first to feel the shortfalls or the mistakes in our response. And I cite that story because, one, it was a turning point in the pandemic, in the sense that finally you had doctors speaking up for such a quiet profession. They came out of where they were working, and they did a public service and sounded that alarm, and we're better off for it because um for that really was a point in time where, when cases started going down, that was also an after effect of the call that they did. And also, when it comes to Filipino health workers overseas, there's still a sector until now, I would say, that feels a lot of pain, or there's a lot, they feel very tested because they're asking for the government to, up until now, they're asking for the government to give them what they promise, what it promised, is special risk allowance and COVID-19 hazard pay. um and so they're serving here, but at the same time abroad, I think, the story of Filipino overseas health workers, it really came to I mean, the spotlight was really on them during this pandemic, because you realize, wow, just how spread out they were. And I think until even now, when the vaccine is starting to be deployed in different countries, you see all over the world that it's either Filipino health workers who are administering those vaccines, or are first to receive them. And I think that says something, our leaders aside, I think that says a lot about also who we are as Filipinos, and what role we have in the world.
Okay, I'd like to, you mentioned the vaccine, Sophia, no? Parang for 2021, I think ito yung big thing. People are looking forward to it. Medyo optimistic yung mga tao. What are the things that you think are our, not only Filipino leaders, but world leaders should focus on, or siguro fix in terms of systems or processes? What will be the bottlenecks, you think?
Well, one major thing that I think needs to be fixed is really access to the vaccine. Um, right now, we're already seeing that over, I think, I remember reading an analysis by Boston Consulting Group saying like over 80% of vaccines, the supply has already been bought by richer countries. And granted, fine, they were countries that financed it. Um, Still, they have bought vaccines to immunize their population like 5 times, 3 times, 5 times over. And I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has shown, is that, you know um just because you manage to immunize, let's say, your entire population, you're still not safe if somebody else in another country isn't protected. And I think that's one thing that we really have to fix, in terms of when it comes to a vaccine. And at the same time, I think it revealed also, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world, how unequal our health systems are, in terms of, where these vaccines are being manufactured, the amount of investment that, let's say, some countries have prioritized in terms of, being able to have that capacity. But it at the end of the day, I mean, that's something that has to be addressed as well.
Mm-hmm. Iya, do you have any thoughts on that?
Same with Sophia. It's really yung distribution and access. And for particularly for the Philippines, the challenge will really be distribution and in storing it. The whole logistics of it will be key here. It will be a test for Duterte to prove that his kind of leadership, even if he might have bungled it at the beginning, if he can do it in an efficient manner where he will really he'll live up to his promise of giving all of the Filipinos like free vaccines, then he set his bar so high for himself, and 2021 will really be the test to see if he can live up to that. And knowing that 2021 is an official the start of the campaign season for 2022, this will definitely factor in when people decide who will succeed him in Malacanang.
So after we survive 2020, we look forward to 2021. Do you think things will be better in next year, given what we've been through? Or meron pa bang mas lalala?
I think one thing we learned in 2020 is it's difficult to say if the next year will be good or will it be bad. Um, 2020 has shown us that the world can be very unpredictable. So I would like to train the spotlight on um, the lesson that we should have learned already by 2021. And the issue of vaccine nationalism, the issue of vaccines, will define whether the pandemic has changed the world for the better or for the worse. Because one response to the pandemic is to close in on ourselves, to be more insular, to focus more on our populations, and to hell with the rest of the world. That is one response. The other kind of response is realizing that all countries in the world are interconnected, and the weakness of one country is a weakness also of my country. Therefore, I should not be hoarding vaccines because if the pandemic gets worse in this poorer country, it will also affect my country. So those are two responses to the pandemic: mm, the insular response and the more interconnected kind of response. And 2021, the issue of the vaccines will show whether, did the world learn from the pandemic? Did the world learn that we should not be selfish kinds of countries and we should look at the bigger picture? Because the pandemic, it is worldwide. We should have a global view. All countries should have a global uh, sensibility. And so that is one lesson that we should have learned uh, already when we enter 2021. If we fail that test, then I fear that the world will just get worse, worse than it was uh, in the pre-pandemic days.
Just to add to what Paterno said, I think the world really cannot afford to exclude itself from, like, the rest of the world. Like, the rich countries cannot really exclude themselves from the rest of the world, because let's face it, immigrants run their countries. Like the rich countries, immigrants run their countries. Like, for example, who's gonna work in the construction if they're gonna ban, like, people from Mexico, from Latin America? And who's gonna take care of their families? Who's gonna work for their healthcare system if they don't have Filipinos, if they don't have any other nationalities to fill in the gaps? Because hindi naman kaya ng mga tao nila lahat yun. So that's what I'd like to add. And also, I think in the case of the Philippines, I'm wary because of the situation of our economy, and I don't know if I can I'm feeling that it's going to be worse, but I'm scared that it might, I mean, it will be really difficult for everyone, more difficult than what it is now, because almost everything is anchored in the economy. And if we cannot fix that, it's going to be downhill from here. And if you talk to, yeah, and
Yeah.
if you talk to businessmen and to other economists, that's what they keep on saying. So I'm fearing.
If you there was a recent um, information data that was published by the Economist, diba? And very, 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 very scary, because the Philippines is there, and the prospects for the Philippine economy are not very, very bright. So if this year medyo we open the economy a bit, just so merong activity and just so kumikita ang mga tao, we don't know if these businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, will be able to thrive in 2021. And of course, pag hindi sila nabuhay, may impact yon on employment, on labor. And syempre, we already can predict na pag maraming taong walang trabaho, maraming taong magugutom. Pag maraming taong nagugutom, tataas ang crime. So it's going to be a domino effect, and ito rin yung dapat bantayan as we approach elections, di ba? So next year will be practically marami ng mangangampanya eh. And we don't even know if the vaccine will be used as in the campaign, di ba? For whoever is running in 2022. Okay. I think one other issue that we haven't really touched on is China, di ba? Past year was also about China, pero medyo, well, most especially because of the pandemic na ano na naman siya, na put under the spotlight. Do you see any shifts in Philippine foreign policy in so far as dealings with China is concerned, are concerned, and especially since meron ng shift in the US, no, from the Republicans, ito na, the Democrats are taking over. Mag-iiba ba ito, and will Southeast Asia and the Philippines feel it insofar as China is concerned? Once again,
Well, I would say,
yeah.
In terms of course, with the new administration in the US, I don't think China will step back or stop, their momentum anytime soon. If anything, we'll still definitely feel it, maybe even more, because suddenly you have a US presence that is, more familiar, stronger, and I think we're already seeing some changes that have been that have happened with because they're taking that development into account. Like recently, the turnaround of the Duterte government and saying that we won't terminate the VFA just yet, we'll extend it. I think that's also a factor of a new administration coming in. While that's not confined to our relationship with just the US, but it also has an effect on our relationship with China. Because as we all know, that sends a message to China, and whether or not they're watching, that definitely does have an effect. At the same time, that isn't to say that the challenges will only be China related and everything will be suddenly rosy with the US, because we all know that even if a new administration has come in the US, that the Biden administration will still have to deal with the Duterte administration for the next 2 years or so, and definitely something that's going to come to the fore and be a point of tension would be human rights, which we know that the past administration, the Trump administration, didn't really raise so much.
Mhm.
So that
Aterna?
might also push us closer to China. I don't know.
So, insofar as China is concerned, Sophia, you think walang masyadong change? China will still be a dominant force, and
Yeah, China will definitely still be a dominant force for us and the region and the rest of the world.
Paterno?
From my end, 2 points. Number one, recently there's been this report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., showing that during the pandemic, China actually increased its patrols of the West Philippine Sea.
Mhm.
And that China is also using the vaccines to solidify its support base in Southeast Asia. So that is one part. China, it appears, is taking advantage of the pandemic to further its goals in the region. Second, Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. We can say a lot about Donald Trump, but it was during President Donald Trump's term that the United States took a clear position on the South China Sea dispute. In the past, even during President Obama's term, the U.S. was non-committal it was, we don't take sides in regional disputes. That was the official line of America. But under Donald Trump, at least in the South China Sea, uh, America took a stronger stance against the abuses, the claims of China. And it was also during President Trump's term that America categorically said that attacks in the South China, in the West Philippine Sea, are covered by the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the U.S. The Philippines has long been asking the U.S. to take a categorical stance on this, make a categorical statement, and it was during Donald Trump's term that America did this. So, just when it comes to the South China Sea, um, America was took a tougher stance against China during President Trump's term. So I'd like to see how President-elect Joe Biden would tackle this problem. Of course, there is this temperamental Trump that comes into play because China is just rah 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 against China, calling COVID-19 the China virus. So that is the whole context of it. Now, Joe Biden, of course, has it sticks to the liberal values, and I'd like to see how he would do this, and if he would take a different stance compared to the last Democratic president that America had, Barack Obama.
Okay, actually, ang interesting insofar as China is concerned, you mentioned nga the shift from the Republicans to the Democrats. So the Republicans took a more categorical position. Parang ito, China, watch out, we're here. And in the Philippines, parang you can bank on us. The US is a strong ally. Yung isang question lang siguro is the issue of human rights. Parang the Democrats have been very strong on human rights. And China, Hong Kong, very clearly those are human rights issues. So baka nga yung tanong is, ano yung magiging approach? Will the Democrats push for more engagement with China, or will it be more aggressive? Kaya lang yung fear naman doon, the US might alienate China. So parang mas mahirap siyang i-draw in, no? But anyway, so speaking of human rights, there have been recent developments also in the ICC. We saw this in the news. So, si ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda declared that there is reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity were committed in Duterte's drug war. Is this something that should be cause for concern of Duterte, of the current administration? And do you think this will have any impact whatsoever on 2022? Or parang Teflon pa rin si Duterte, and whoever he endorses in 2022 will have very, very strong chances of winning despite this human rights issue hanging over their heads? Pia, what do you think?
I think it all depends on how this report is used by people who would challenge Duterte's leadership. So by itself, diba, it's obviously a development that shows that there is reason to believe there were human rights abuses in his drug war, right? But si Malacanang's spin on this is that wala pa namang investigation. That's just like parang a line in a report that basically concluded that Fatou Bensouda will have to still decide whether or not to ask for authority to conduct an investigation. So their spin is wala namang talagang finding na may human rights violations, which of course is a wrong thing to say because that's their finding about crimes against humanity. But the investigation is to find out whether or not the Philippine justice system is willing or able to actually bring justice towards these crimes against humanity, these human rights violations. So I think that it's a powerful messaging tool if used in a way that will kind of gain momentum for the movement that is saying that Duterte is a human rights violator. But obviously, the sector will have to find a better way to counter Malacanang's spin, because Malacanang is very good at spinning. Diba? They're very good at saying that this is just politicized, this is just the Liberal Party throwing these allegations because they don't want to win in 2022. So the anyone who wishes to challenge Duterte has to challenge that spin, that actually no, this is a grievance that is legitimate, and we are fighting this fight because we want to protect all human rights, and not just the human rights of like the opposition or of Duterte's critics. This is not just about politics. This is about our rights and our freedoms as a people. So so far, no one has really been able to really capture this and make average Filipinos see the value in actually taking this fight to the ICC. So it really depends on how these groups will use the ruling. But I think that in the international sphere, it definitely could be, it's proof, right, that what the critics have been saying all along are true. They're not just grabbed from thin air. They're not just a figment of imagination, because the ICC prosecutor herself sees reason to believe in these allegations.
Paterna,
I agree with
yeah.
I agree with Pia in that it all depends on how the opposition or whoever's gonna run next year, like if like no matter if that issue is like big internationally, if they really cannot translate it to the ordinary Filipinos, it won't have any impact. I mean, magkakaroon siguro pero not enough to change an election or to, to elect another candidate na totally opposed kay Duterte. It's not enough, I think. And I feel at this point, economy is more important for Filipinos because it's something closer to their everyday lives. Like, maraming namamatay sa kanila, maraming nagugutom, maraming nawawala ng trabaho. So for them, yung recency effect pati na itong mga drug war and everything has taken a back seat. Although may balita pa rin ito ngayon, it has taken a back seat kasi ilang years ago na yung ingay about that. And ngayon, mas importante sa mga Pilipino yung makakain nila. So I think another thing pa dyan that will affect it may be a political issue, but kung anong extent ng effect niya sa elections, it will also depend on how the opposition will unite or will strategize or will use that human rights aspect.
Interesting. Actually, yes, you mentioned nga the economy, no? So parang, pero remember, nung 2016, yan din yung ginamit nung the Aquino candidates, no? The Liberal Party. Parang economy. Pero Duterte went against the grain, and then sabi niya, crime. Kasi kahit na hindi nagfi-figure yan sa surveys, yun yung kanyang gut feel. So, dito rin, parang it would be curious lang, no? Parang ano ba yung magre-resonate? Because in this year also, if you remember, di ba? China yung lumalabas na issue na magre-resonate sa mga Pinoy. So, we don't know whether the opposition, for example, would be in a better place using China, the economy, the pandemic, or even crime, no? as platforms. So,
I
yan
think
yung
kasi
dapat pagkuhan.
I think, Ma'am Cha, yung difference lang in terms of the topic of economy nung 2015 to 2016 and now, kasi parang ito mas concrete yung effect na alam mo yon, maraming namamatay sa paligid mo, maraming walang trabaho. And then you see like the rest of the world moving on. So parang feeling ko mas concrete yung effect as compared to yung yung economy, and then you're just pushing for continuity. Parang ito yung parang may longing for change. Parang pwedeng yun yung gawin ng opposition na parang alam mo yun, like a strategy. If I don't know if that will be effective, but I think in relation to your question about human rights, for me mas significant for Filipinos yung economy than human rights, than the ICC issue.
Paterna, may dagdag ka?
Yeah, for me, the ICC, possible ICC investigation will not change the course of the drug war in the Philippines if the big democracies do not jump in and use it as basis for example, giving access to vaccines to the Philippines. If the big democracies do not latch on to this, anything that the ICC can come up with or investigate, I don't think Duterte will care. He's a type of president who doesn't care what other people say about him. But the way I read him, he cares about, um, will I get what I want from this country or that? And the vaccines are the biggest issue right now. And if big democracies tie human rights to the vaccines as a condition, then the ICC investigation, the possible investigation, could make a dent. But if the big powers do not jump in, I don't think Duterte will care.
And I also think lang, like a quick point, I think it will also be tricky for the international community to use the vaccine parang as hostage for the human rights. Um, Parang kasi ang labo na baka sabihin you're against human rights, but what about the people suffering, right?
Yeah.
Which will also have an impact sa ibang bansa. So, yun lang, medyo tricky yun.
Correct.
If I can add lang quickly,
Yeah.
like just really quickly, I think opposition aside, when we look at the international community, significant din yung ICC findings. If we remember earlier, this time last year, and a little bit earlier into this year, the U.S. the U.S. Congress did take some action against, you know, human rights violations under the drug war under the banner of the Magnitsky Act. And that's not something that's just particular to the United States. There are similar laws there are similar laws in place in places like the European Union, in Australia, and there in Canada. There are countries who have taken up the agenda of passing their own version of the Magnitsky Act or their Magnitsky sanctions. And the ICC is relevant in that it serves as what Camille and what everyone here has been saying, proof that there is some possible basis of uh, crimes against humanity that happened under the Duterte's drug war. And so that's coming from a third party source, an international source at that. And perhaps the timing also of how countries might use that, not necessarily tying into the vaccines, but there are already existing like mechanisms for it to be used, like our GSP plus status with the European Union. And if you look at the Biden administration's foreign policy, one thing that they do intend to try to tie human rights into is, as a condition for certain economic perks. Like if you want to have, I don't know, like less tariffs, or if you want, these deals, you're gonna have to make sure that human rights are upheld in your country. So if not the vaccine, there are already other ways for that to happen in terms of the economy, which Camille already mentioned. It might be a stronger issue for Filipinos than human rights at this point.
Okay. For the media, no, for 2021, I was wondering, kasi we've been working under extreme stress. We're working under lockdown, getting stories, talking to sources, and really being unable to go out. No, I was wondering, parang how do you foresee the pandemic? Kasi it will not go away soon. Meron pa rin yan next year and even 2022 siguro hanggat hindi maayos yung vaccines. How do you see this affecting the work of journalists? And how good will journalists be kung patuloy pa rin tong pandemic na to? Compromise ba tayo doon?
I think for me, it's gonna be two ways. Like one is the pandemic will continue to change the way that journalists do their work, and of course, um, it will also give more shield to for the government kasi gagawin nilang excuse yon lalo, 'di ba? And another thing is I think it will also further change rather the way the public consumes media content. So tayong mga like platforms and even tayong journalists, we have to continuously find ways to change it kasi now globally merong change in terms of the content that the public wants. Kasi parang tayo as journalists, di ba? We feel that these are newsworthy stories, but do the public want and need it at this time of stress? So parang yun yung another test for us maybe as journalists. And also I think on the practical side, it will be more if journalists or if news groups would want to really cover issues on the ground, it will be very expensive for you, Ma'am Chai, for the news managers, kasi you have to conduct tests, quarantine, isolation, insurance, etc. And this ties into the kind of output that the news organization can produce. I mean, Rappler so far can do it. We excel at what we do, but until when? Because it's we're also human. It's taking a toll on our mental health, physical health, and if the pandemic continues, it's going to be a challenge also for the whole organization.
Yeah, certainly. Maybe last question na lang, no? 2020, 2021, the best and the worst. What are your best and worst case scenarios for the coming year? Sophia.
I think best case scenario is that we get the vaccine sooner than we hope and we think, and we can quote unquote return to normal in as much as that's possible. But the worst case, of course, the worst case scenario would be that we don't get it, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to both maintain all these minimum public health standards and at the same time, I mean, on an individual level and also in a institutional level, like across different government agencies, having that in place, and also, it will become harder for that to stay in place and at the same time keep the economy um I don't want to say lockdown, but like keep the economy constrained to a certain degree because you're also approaching an election year, and we all know that that's going to change the landscape of a lot of things. So best case scenario, we get the vaccine sooner than we hope. Worst case, things stay the same, which would be a very difficult place to be in and maintain.
I think same. I think we can all agree that the best case scenario is to get the vaccine soon enough, diba? Pero I think for me the worst case is cases continue to rise and it gets really worse, like economy and all. Not only because it's gonna be hard for us now, but I feel this will really have an impact on the future generations because we are now changing the fundamentals of how we live, and how are these children now gonna I mean, what's their future gonna be if it's gonna be worse for the Philippines for the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years? It's gonna affect the next generations for sure.
Ako, Ma'am Shai, I think that the best case scenario for 2021 for me would be that this pandemic signals a turning point for the way we measure our future leaders. And since 2021 is the lead up to the 2022 elections, and my beat is all about the leaders of this country, that people will start to really be more active in politics, seeing how politics can really have a concrete effect on their lives. Because that's what the pandemic also revealed to us, diba? That if we vote a crappy leader, we'll get crappy crisis management. And this might not be the last crisis that our country will face, or even the last pandemic our country will face in the next few years. So we really have to pay more attention to who we vote. And hopefully this pandemic convinces people to register to vote for 2022 elections. And 2021 kasi will be the time where, diba, these candidates will be out and about doing sorties, making speeches. So I hope that more people now will start to listen up and have better standards for who they will elect. And so my best case scenario is that people will vote good leaders in 2022, and whereas the worst case scenario would be that we don't learn from this lesson, we don't learn from this year, and we continue to live in a fantasy world where no, kung kahit sino man nandyan, 'di ba? We'll just have to survive whoever's there. We'll just have to endure whatever kind of leadership they provide, and bahala na si Batman.
Well said.
For me, I'd like to go back to my point a while ago. The worst case scenario would be countries would become even more insular, even more parochial, even more selfish, making the world even worse than it was during the pre-pandemic days. That would be the worst case scenario. The best case scenario for me would, again, that the world and countries would realize the interconnectedness of each other. And in large part, that depends on the so called new leader of the free world, of the so called free world. Uh, America has its faults, but we need America. We need the leadership of America. And with America in the hands of Joe Biden in 2021, I'd like, I am hopeful that we are on our way to that best case scenario where countries would realize that they have to help each other, but countries cannot realize that if there's no conductor. um, we hate to say that, we some people hate to consider that America is really the leader, but America is what we have. And so far, that is what we are counting on. Will Joe Biden, the Time Person of the Year, help change the world for the better and lead us to this best case scenario? Because at the end of the day, this best case scenario, again, would affect people like you and me, people like us in the Philippines, big powers and ordinary people like us. Very interconnected, and that is what we would like to see in 2021.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I think we all agree that the worst thing that could happen to us and to the world is for the status quo to remain. This has to change. There has to be action that will that will change things. And as Pia pointed out, we really need better leaders. That's the clearest lesson that this whole year and this pandemic is teaching us. So yes, especially for the Philippines, 2022 is really a matter of choice. No? We choose our leaders and we become responsible for the choices that we make. So hopefully there will be more civic engagement. More people will go out and register and vote in 2022. So thank you very much for watching Newsbreak Chats. Don't forget, Camille Elemia will take over on January 2021. This is Chai Hofilenia. Thank you for watching.